Hello, I'm Teresa Piacentini, and this is part two of the lecture recording on theorising the hostile environment. And I'll be looking at in this part two the hostile environment as it applies to asylum and also ways of resisting the hostile environment. So, just to begin, when we think about the hostile environment, there are a number of areas I want to cover in relation to asylum, and the first is dispersal. Now, the UK has a long history of dispersal through quota schemes as a form of managed migration, and this date back to the 70s with Vietnamese refugees and Ugandans, the 90s with Bosnians, the 2000s with gateway refugees, and then most recently with Syrian vulnerable people and the Afghani citizen resettlement scheme. But dispersal, as it was introduced in the 1999 Act, was the first time it became really a central pillar of policy. Um, and what dispersal and quota schemes do is they show something is being done. They're often evoked when the UK mentions its so called proud history of welcome. So, in the UK, successive governments have restricted the welfare and working rights of people claiming asylum in order to reduce economic pull factors, even though there's no empirical evidence that welfare or work are in fact pull factors. And so different legislative acts have prevented people seeking asylum from accessing labour, moving them out of mainstream benefits, and steadily decreasing levels of financial support as they go through the system. And this means people are prohibited from working, they are prohibited from continuing education, from moving house, and forced into poverty for an indeterminate period of time. And so this reflects the slow attritional nature of violence through the systematic impoverishment and exclusion of people rather than protection. The policy of dispersal of those seeking asylum was introduced then in 1999, and the legislative intention was that by distribution across the UK on a no choice basis, no one area would be overburdened by the obligation of supporting people seeking asylum. So it was the only it remains the only means of obtaining accommodation if you have no family or friends or are destitute. It removes the possibility for kinship and social networks. If you do know people in one part of the UK, you are not able to stay with them or stay near them. It's an accommodation led driven policy, so led by availability of housing, not by need. Um, and dispersal sites themselves are often in areas of multiple socio-economic deprivation, where housing quality is poor and often housing is vacant because of its substandard quality. Local authorities opt in to become dispersal areas. And what this does is it creates a kind of social geography of specific neighbourhoods and places that come to be seen as asylum neighbourhoods. But these would have predominantly been what might have been described white housing estates, which raises concerns over cultural compatibility and society fractured by the existence of parallel lives, which debates that echo the British race relations from the 70s and the 80s. Um, and this idea of a particular social geography, I think, has particular interest not only in how people then come to find themselves living and trying to survive asylum, but also the spaces for resistance that can emerge. Dispersal itself fuels a kind of not in my backyardism that legitimizes hostility and reinforces undesirability in the public consciousness. People come to be understood as a threat, as a drain on resources, as a burden, but it also reproduces kind of parasitic discourses around people which have dehumanizing effects and also attributes different conceptions of human worth. The second area I want to look at is welfare as a form of immigration control. Now, since it's a long-standing history of the relationship between immigration and welfare, which traces back to the Aliens Act 1905, which was Britain's first modern immigration act. Current legislation restricts people's access to social security, which was enshrined in the 1999 Act, the Immigration and Asylum Act. And that stated that people subject to immigration control should have no recourse to public funds. This condition prohibits people, as I've already said, to mainstream benefits, universal tax credit, child tax credit, as well as local authority housing assistance. and it's applied to people who are considered undocumented and most people with time limited visas in the UK. In fact, it was under Labour then, under David Blunkett as then Home Secretary, who removed the responsibility for meeting the basic financial and housing needs of people seeking asylum from local authorities and placed it with a newly created National Asylum Support Service. And this is linked to a common myth surrounding asylum migration that has been and continues to be that people claiming asylum are really economic migrants in disguise. The setting up of a segregated welfare system put paid to this myth. And you can see there on the slide the kinds of financial support people receive. So there are two support options. One is financial assistance only, where people have their own accommodation, although this is rare, or financial assistance plus housing. But in order to gain support, people have to demonstrate they are destitute, and accommodation is offered on a no-choice basis around the UK. Early on, it was provided, welfare support, financial support was provided via a cashless voucher system, but this was then replaced and people receive their support at post offices via a cashless credit card. And there has the uplift in the amount of money people have received since 1999 can be counted in pennies. And in COVID, the COVID context, the uplift was of around 3 pence, 3 pence a week. So looking at detention as another area of asylum, of the relationship between the hostile environment and asylum. So detention has been used historically in the UK to ward against terrorist threat and during wartime. But as a form of enforcement of immigration legislation, it has increased in the UK and across the European Union. The UK is the only country in Europe where people are detained without any time limit. Now, it is becoming more widespread across Europe. The rationale in the UK is that it only occurs at the end of the process. However, we know that that's actually not quite the case and that people may be detained at any point in the process. There's a huge financial cost, so it's both ineffective and expensive because it doesn't really act as a deterrence, but it definitely demonstrates that something is being done. And we can see here some of the costs from figures of this year, from March of this year. But there's also a huge human cost. And if you have some time, I'd like you to pause and listen to Michael and Holly's story or watch the Behind the Wire documentary about life in Scotland's only immigration detention centre at Dungavel to give us a sense of the actual physical and emotional impacts of detention, both during detention, but also how people try and survive life after detention. And I also wanted to flag up here a point about hotel detention during COVID. In response to the pandemic in March 2020, the Home Office, through their accommodation provider Mears, determined to house recently arrived people seeking asylum and people who were destitute in hotel accommodation. And this was framed by the UK government as a public health informed approach. So people were moved at very short notice. They were provided with full boards, which meant that any cash they did receive or cashless credit they received was removed. And they were given dinner, bed, and breakfast, although of a very poor quality and certainly not sufficient. The temporary nature of a contingency accommodation for many increased feelings of uncertainty and extreme isolation and had a traumatizing effect, as we can see this quote from the Scotland in Lockdown project. People were moved with little notice, with no sense of how long they would be in hotels, and the hotel was often described as prison-like, mirroring in many ways how immigration detention is described by advocacy organisations like Detention Action, creating more anxiety and stress. So already facing daily hardship, this was exacerbated by COVID and being contained in hotels. And in June 2020, there was a tragic incident in Glasgow, a stabbing that ended with one person shot dead by the police, that threw into stark relief that rather than actively seeking to improve people's conditions during lockdown, the Home Office and its subcontractor put in place measures that directly undermine people's safety and well-being. A last area I want to look at in terms of the Home Office, the hostile environment and asylum is this question of deportations and deportable bodies. So deportations are, since the 80s, they've been routinely drawn on in government rhetoric as a means of demonstrating effective control over borders and immigration. So a mechanism by which states measure and signal their own effectiveness, a way of showing something is being done. Um, and if you look at the Go Home Mapping Immigration Controversy book by Hannah Jones and colleagues, they map out the genealogy of the deportation propaganda machine. So they show us that in 2006, for example, then Prime Minister Tony Blair appointed a new hardline Home Secretary, John Reid, in response to a series of scandals around perceived failures to deport foreign criminals and control levels of so called illegal immigration. And this led to the launch of a new communication strategy designed to demonstrate a very visible, tough approach to controlling borders, including getting more images of immigration raids in the media, inviting journalists along to witness raids, and garnering media attention to the physical toughness of the border. So, whilst this campaign targeted immigration offenders, it also had an audience of the law abiding and tax paying public in mind. And a shift in audience that was made more explicit in 2008 when the Home Office funded an independent television production company to develop a reality television programme called UK Border Force. And indeed, the use of the phrase go home as a form of propaganda and publicity also drew on the racist tropes of the 1960s and 70s and 80s, a slogan that featured prominently in racist National Front graffiti. And here the government had put it on a poster. Looking at deportation normalisation, since the A90s, there has been a deportation turn, and the rise in the use of deportation has seen developments of the infrastructural capacity and legal powers to deport, and a newfound public and official enthusiasm for expulsion. So, deportation is no longer imagined as an extreme and exceptional use of state power, but recast as a just, reasonable, and proportionate response to unwanted migrants. And May's hostile environment approaches and ethos have made increasing numbers of people deportable. And so, what we see here at stake in the politics of deportation is not just the increase in removals, but also an increase in illegality. And with that, an escalation in the vulnerability of some to harm and exploitation. Um, People become deportable, and also their deportability signals their disposability. And there's a human cost again here, just to highlight the case of Jimmy Mubenga, who in the 12th of October 2010 was detained pending deportation at Brook House Immigration Removal Centre at Gatwick Airport and died as a result of being restrained in a chokehold on a forced return flight. 3 G4S guards were accused of killing him by forcibly pushing his head down and restricting his breathing. His last words were to other passengers, "You are watching them kill me. I can't breathe." So, really, just to kind of tie in these ideas of gradual wounding and slow violence and of asylum, um, we can see there is a direct impact of these policies and of asylum policies in the everyday context and what people are exposed to, both physically and psychologically. And these are not accidental outcomes, but intentional. They are designed in to make the asylum system as hard as possible to dissuade people from claiming asylum. And we can think that this creates a human classification and differentiation that sets some apart from others, where the conditions of impoverishment are meant to be more tolerable for some. Um, and this also plays into these ideas of categorical fetishism, how people are categorized, imagined, constructed, and defined. It also removes people directly from public view, so there is not this spectacle of the daily pain they experience as a result of state policies. Their impoverishment disperses them and removes them from the public sphere, from public transport, from clothing shops, from restaurants, from social spaces, from anywhere but the cheapest supermarkets. So the hostile environment inserts itself not just into interactions in the everyday, but also how one lives in the everyday. And this slow violence can be conceptualized as a form of necropolitics, as we understand the harms done to those going through the asylum system that are designed into the structures which are supposed to be supporting them. And the harms done constitute slow violence, and this is enabled through the structures of the state. So, if necropolitics is the most visible form of governing through death, then slow violence is its mode of operation and its effect at the level of the everyday. And although we've been focusing on the UK, the same concepts may be used to frame how we understand the treatment of some humans over others, whether that is in the US in immigration detention, or in offshore detention in Australia, or in the construction of camps at the borders of Europe. So the hostile environment is framed something that shapes social reality, and it brings in these questions of power. Who are the groups who desire borders? What are the decision-making processes which enable certain groups to make these decisions? Who undertakes border work? And an important point here is the perception of the hostile environment and the kinds of everyday borders it creates as a management mechanism. But this also raises, I think, a really crucial question. To what extent does the hostile environment and do borders function as barriers to movement and interaction, or as an interface where meeting places and points of contact are created? Are we only able to become border guards, or are there other ways of engaging in bordering activities? And this brings us to a last part of our discussion on resistance. So, to explore resistance, I think it's worthwhile just returning briefly to what we might have described in the past as migrant agency. So, rethinking migrants, not just as objects of study, but also subjects. And the main dominant model for looking at agency would have traditionally been through the lens of the association, resulting often in largely descriptive case studies describing what migrants do. So the association has tended to be the start and end point of understandings of mobilisation. Before the 90s, this would have been very functionalist. But in the post 1990s, a more critical engagement with social arrangements that people find themselves in has emerged. And what we are seeing increasingly is a shift in focus to the perspective of migrants and their identification, so kind of from a standpoint perspective, but also their identification with shared causes as experienced by other marginalised groups. So we see this kind of crossover, a connection between migrant and non-migrant populations that recognises that societies are often hostile, and a recognition of state violence and a push for systemic change. So it's important, I think, here just to flag up that resistance and activism will vary in terms of structure, recognition by the state and other actors in focus. But we also can note a shift towards experience-based activism and resistance. The classical condition of the migrant becomes the grounds for people's own marginalisation, but it also provides the knowledge and the resources to build their organisation and mobilisation. So if you have some time, I'd like you to look at one of these campaigns. The Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants has a long-standing campaign fighting against right-to-right checks. Several Royal Colleges of Medicine and medical NGOs, such as Docs Not Cops, have spoken out about immigration checks and data sharing in healthcare. And also the Against Borders for Children established a campaign against the hostile environment in school. We've also got Unis Resist Border Controls, looking at higher education. And Living Rent has become increasingly involved with the No Evictions Network to support tenants' rights and fight against lock changes for people who are being forced out of their homes, who are considered appeals rights exhausted. So I think I would like you just to take some time to look at these campaigns and reflect, how they frame what they do in terms of racism and anti-racism work, how they might help, are they effective in challenging the hostile environment, and also how you might connect these campaigns on the ground to the theoretical around domopolitics, necropolitics, and slow violence, how these campaigns may push back and offer alternative perspectives. And we can bring some of that discussion to class. So just as a final part of this discussion, I wanted to just bring in more explicitly the work of Ambalavanur Sivanandan. His work is framed by the community self-help tradition and Black unity movement of African, Caribbean and Asian organising in the form of community groups and associations in the 80s in the UK. organising across ethnic classifications that has emerged from shared experience of discrimination in housing, education, and employment. So, real mobilisation and organising around shared causes and issues. Um, Sivanandan's more explicitly critical perspectives on associational development emphasise that organising and associating emerges through choice, but also through a desire for important social change in individuals' lives. And so communities of resistance emerge and have transformative qualities. And the collective action results in the formation of groups as actors who are specifically looking to counter, offer alternative narratives and discourses and experiences, and effect some change of how people are treated and perceived. And I'd like to just finish with the image on the right. So the image on the right is from the Kenmure Street protest in Pollokshields in Glasgow on the 13th of May 2021. Now, Pollokshields is a hugely diverse neighbourhood that woke up on the morning of Eid to an immigration raid on its doorstep that resulted in a mass anti-immigration raid mobilisation led by the No Evictions Network. The immigration van couldn't leave. It was surrounded, first of all, it was surrounded by police to protect the immigration officers, but then it was surrounded by activists, one of whom got under the van and stayed there for 8 hours. Now, activists reported that Police Scotland were helping immigration officials by trying to persuade them to disperse. But in solidarity, thousands of Pollokshields locals, as well as people from across the city, gathered to prevent this raid. The two men, both from India, were eventually released. And the success of this campaign is not just about this moment of mobilisation, but it has to go to the grassroots infrastructure that has built up across Glasgow through its history of migrant solidarity since it became a dispersal city for refugees in 2000. So this isn't just about a moment of mobilisation. This is about a concerted effort of organisation, of a coherence across shared causes and issues, and a commitment to transformative change. And I think it also raises another question about what meaningful and effective structural change can look like, and that solidarity as a practice can't just be limited to the moments, but has to be engaged, has to be about centering people's perspectives and experiences, and taking into account the lived experience of those who are really at the sharp end of hostile environment policies. This may help us find a way to develop an alternative kind of doma politics. And I think this is something that we could reflect on further and discuss together in class.